So we're in our sixth and final week of this series in Galatians, Galatians One Love. And so what that means is we're in the sixth and final chapter of Galatians. But before we get to the sixth chapter, I want to spend just a few minutes with a review of Galatians in case you have missed some things along the way or in case you are just joining us. Galatians is a letter written from the Apostle Paul to the church in Galatia. So we call them the Galatians. Here's the backstory to the letter. Paul went to Galatia, this city, bringing about the good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ, the good news of God's love for all people. This message of grace, which is a gift given from God. It's always a free gift. It's never earned. In fact, if it's earned, it's not really grace, is it? So they started this little Jesus movement community, something we call a church. Soon after this church was established, Paul leaves to the next city to bring some more good news, more love. Soon after Paul's departure, a group of people come into Galatia, a group that we might call missionaries, and they start saying to this newly formed church in Galatia, look, y'all are doing it wrong. You need to go back to the old way. You need to go back to the law. And when we talk about the law, we're talking about all the 600 plus laws found in the Torah, which is the first 5 books of what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And it's not that these laws are bad. They served a purpose, but what they were teaching was you take these laws and use and abuse them. Use them as a measuring stick to see where you measure up with God. And the church in Galatia actually bought it. And they went back to it. And they started using these laws to determine where they stood with God. If they could follow the law exactly, then they were way up here with God. But if they couldn't, they were down here. And so they never really knew exactly where they stood with God. And in the midst of all this, they were busy creating barriers between themselves and others. They were determining who's in and who's out, who's clean, who's unclean, who's worthy of God's love and who's not. And so they even said to the Gentiles, the people not like them, they said to their males, you all, sure, you can be a part of this God stuff, but you're going to need to be circumcised like us. Paul hears this, and he's angry. Seriously? Y'all are trading in the gospel for this? And so he writes this letter. And Paul has some harsh words for them. And as I read and reread Galatians, I find myself having grace for the Galatians because I actually find my story in their story. They were a complacent people. They thought they had this religious stuff nailed. They were following the laws exactly. And now we should also keep in mind, these would have been a people who would have been intimately familiar with suffering. Because remember, they lived right in the heart of the first century Roman Empire, the most powerful empire the world has ever known. A global military superpower that extended all the way from England to India. And so they would have known a bit about living under Roman occupation and the oppression that comes with that. So they may not be able to control all this outside stuff, but when it came to the religious laws, when it came to the God stuff, they could do this thing right. And Paul essentially comes along to them and says, listen, you all have a spiritual problem. There's a disconnect between you and God, and by the way, you have created it, not God. And so I want you to just take a moment and think about what a major blow this would have been to them to hear these words. The thing closest to their heart, and they're being told there's a disconnect. Here's how Paul begins to end the letter. So we're at the end of chapter 6, then we're going to work our way towards the beginning. But verse 14. But as for me, God forbid that I should boast about anything except for the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ. The world has been crucified through me, through him, and I have been crucified to the world. Now let's pause there for just a moment, because that is some heavy language. And you may be saying to yourself, Why is Paul always talking about the cross? What is his obsession with the cross? Now, in our culture, in present, current culture, there are all kinds of theologies about the cross. Many of these theologies I find harmful and destruction, and they just create shame. This isn't what Paul was talking about. We could do a whole other sermon series on current theologies of the cross. But for Paul, the cross represented everything in our world that needs to die in order for new things to live. And for Jesus, the story of death is somehow the engine for new life. And the early Christians understood this. Many of them understood it in exactly these terms. Death is somehow the engine for new life. And also recognize what Paul is doing here by mentioning the cross. He's saying a big me too. The most powerful words we humans can use, me too. And he always roots it in his story. And by mentioning the cross, he's saying, guys, do you remember? I was the Hebrew of Hebrews, he says. I knew the laws better than anyone. I followed the religious laws. In fact, when the impure and unclean, when they tried to be part of the God thing, I was the one that kept them out. I went after them and persecuted them. I know what it means for things to need to die in order for me to actually live. This is my story. So the very next verse. So, being circumcised or not being circumcised doesn't mean anything. What matters is a new creation. All the rules, all the laws, they don't matter. And can't you hear the Galatians responding to Paul? Yeah, but Paul, we have kept the Sabbath. We have kept the prayers. Paul, we have kept others out. We have allowed them or not allowed them to come in and be a part of the God thing because they're unclean and we've used the laws to establish it. And can't you hear Paul respond? Yeah, but are you being made new? Some years ago, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table in his kitchen, and he was sitting across from me. He was my sponsor, who was serving as a guide to sponsor me through the 12 steps of a recovery program. And you know, it was one of my first meetings with him. And I was prepared to hear lots of things about myself. I was prepared to hear about the mistakes I had made along the way and the messes I'd made and the messes I was going to have to clean up. And the truth is, if the conversation went that way, it would have been easy. Because give me a measuring stick so I can measure where I am. I'm good at that. But what he told me was a lot harder. He said, Ryan, you know you have a spiritual problem here. And there's a disconnect between you and God. And you've created that disconnect. And you know, when he said it to me, my outward response was, oh, yeah, I get that. Mm-hmm. Inwardly, I was so scared. I was so scared because it felt like things around me were crumbling. And everything within me was crumbling. And this is the only thing I could get right. The religious stuff, the God stuff, the Jesus stuff, it's the only thing I could do right. Take that away from me. Then you've taken everything. I have nothing. And you know what fear does? It ultimately, if you don't get a handle on it, it turns into anger. And mine went from fear to anger really quickly. I got in the car and I started having this conversation with myself out loud. You just don't know. You don't know me. I have a biblical studies degree from college, and then after that I went to seminary and got a master's of divinity degree. You don't know. You want to say there's a disconnect. Pfft, spiritual problem. After I could sit with that for a bit, I was able to understand that he was saying to me something very similar as to what Paul was saying to the Galatians. Yeah, Ryan. At this point, none of that matters. Are you being made new? And you see, what I realized in the process was that my relationship with God had to die so that my relationship with God could actually live. And in my experience, crisis, whether that be pain or grief or unknowing or the big questions, the big issues, the big doubt, crisis is the thing that comes along and completely shatters complacency. And you see, I want to be clear. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with being complacent or with being comfortable. But it's usually when life is going good. It's going okay. We've got this. We can do this on our own. We may or may not need God. We may or may not need community and other people. But when this crisis comes along, when you're faced with the big questions, the big loss, do you let it open you? Or do you keep your fists clenched even tighter? Does that pain open you? When your heart is breaking, do you let it break? When the big questions and big doubts come up, do you actually let them come to the surface? Because when it comes to things like crisis and suffering, you can't go back. And that's the desire, right? When we go through these big things, when we're in the middle of them, we cry out, man, if things could just be the way they used to be, if we could just go back to that place. But if you've ever been through any amount of grief, you know that you can't go back. It's impossible. The only way forward is to go right through it. Are you being made new? You see, when you decide you're not going to let that thing, that crisis or that suffering, you're not going to let that thing harden your heart, but you're actually going to let it break your heart into a million pieces so that God's love and healing can seep in through the cracks, so that eventually God's love and healing might flow out of you and into the lives of others. Then you're being made new. And here's the thing about being made new. When you're in a room full of people and that person starts to talk about their pain, their suffering, their crisis, you don't have to hang your head in shame and walk away. You don't have to walk away because you're uncomfortable. You don't have to leave the room. You are being made new. You get to stay put. You get to look them in the eye and say those most powerful words. Me too. I've been there. Me too. And you see that Me Too? It is the sweet spot of the Jesus movement. It is the very center of the Jesus movement. Because this is what it means to carry one another's burdens. And for Paul, when he's talking about becoming a new creation, he's talking about the freedom to actually be part of a community, the freedom to carry one another's burdens. Love, and he says love is the thing that replaces the law. Love fulfills the law is the language he uses. But the Galatians thought it was about working harder, doing more, trying to follow the law more closely. But love steps in and replaces that kind of complacency. Here's how Paul says it at the beginning of chapter 6. Live creatively, friends. If someone falls into sin, forgivingly restore him, saving... there's a chair behind me. Saving your critical comments for yourself. You might be needing forgiveness before the day's out. Stoop down and reach out to those who are oppressed. Share their burdens and so complete Christ's law. If you think you are too good for that, you are badly deceived. So the question becomes, when everything around you starts to crumble, when everything inside of you is crashing, Do you have the courage to be part of a community? And the truth is, there will be times when you have no clue what it looks like for you to carry someone's burdens. And that's okay. It's okay. Show up, be present. And I realize what I'm saying there. I realize this is some of the hardest stuff we can do, because for you to show up in the midst of suffering is just some of the hardest work we can do. But remember, God is the one who is creating the new thing, not you. Our job is just to get rid of that barrier of complacency so the new thing can actually happen. So about a year ago, just over a year ago, I received a phone call from someone in this congregation. And she was telling me that there's a young couple in the hospital. And this young couple, she was 6 months pregnant. And they had just given birth, but things didn't go well. And they were preparing to lose their baby girl. And the person I was talking to said they wanted a pastor. And so as I'm driving to the hospital, I have no clue what it means to carry a burden in this situation. I have no clue what I'm doing. I've never done this before. And when I get to the hospital, little Ellie Grace had just taken her final breath. And as you can imagine, the couple and the family and the friends in this room, they were absolutely heartbroken, filled with intense grief. And so we pray a prayer over little Ellie. And I go home that afternoon. And you know, when I get home and open the garage, one of my girls, Sailor or Shiloh, one of them always runs out to greet me, and they help open my door, and they jump up in my lap, still in the car, and they give me a big hug. And on this date was Selah, my oldest daughter, who was 5 at the time, and she jumps up in my lap and hugs me. And I just hold her for a little longer, because you know when you encounter that kind of pain and suffering, that kind of grief, it's no longer an intellectual endeavor, it's a hard endeavor. And then I go inside and I see Tammy, my wife, and I'm filled with all kinds of fear. And this fear turns into a little bit of guilt, because she was 5 months pregnant at the time with our little baby boy, Breck. And see, when you're in the middle of it, you're allowed to ask all sorts of questions, even if they don't make theological sense, even if they're not good questions. We still ask them. Like, man, their baby's not here, but I have babies. And I've got one on the way. And you know, a few days later, we held a little service for Ellie. And it was a beautiful time of tears and laughter. And I get home that afternoon, and Tammy, my wife, says, hey, we should have Cassie and Jensen over for dinner sometime. I said, we can't do that. I was filled with fear. See, I was thinking, see, Tammy, you're pretty pregnant. You're not getting any smaller here. You're getting bigger, and it's more obvious. And I don't know how Cassie's going to feel about this. I don't know how she's going to feel about being around you, and is it going to be too fresh? A few weeks pass by. She says it again. I said, No, we can't do that. A couple more weeks pass by, and at my wife's urging, we invite Cassie and Jensen over for dinner. And this really cool thing started to happen. We started to journey together and carry that burden together. And it was cool because you could see it. You could see this new thing happening, an opening. And Cassie and Jensen started getting involved here at church. Here at St. Luke's, they started becoming part of our communitas small groups, singing in the choir, being here on Sundays. And it was cool because what I was seeing, and this brings great joy as being a pastor, you all, this community started carrying their burden with them. When you don't know how to carry the burden, that's okay if you have community, because they step in and they help do the carrying. So this morning I have invited Cassie and Jensen to come up and share a piece of their story with us. I've asked them to share what it was like and what it's like now. And before we begin, I just want to publicly recognize that you all are brave and courageous. And I hope I could speak for you all on this point. We hold moments like these, we hold them as sacred moments, and we're grateful. Welcome.
Thanks. So Ryan asked us to kind of talk about how it was back then and where we are now. And so at the beginning, there's no real way to explain how we felt. We were just lost and devastated, and there's no words. It was just the worst thing that could ever happen. And you start to question a lot of things, like, why us? Why would God let this happen? Why do bad things happen to good people? What could we have done differently? And in that, there's a lot of anger. And we felt that for a good long while. We felt like our life was ripped away from us and our future was just taken. Up until Ellie was born, we were living a pretty complacent life. We were college sweethearts. We graduated. We got good careers. We got married and then found out we were pregnant, and so we bought a new house. We were coasting through every phase of life with ease, and there was no hard times. And then our lives changed forever in an instant. Going through this experience, I think we could have made one of two choices. One would have been to go down the path in which we were heading at the beginning, full of anger and bitterness, a path holding these feelings deep inside and just kind of burying them so we didn't have to face it, and kind of going back to that complacent lifestyle that we were in. But soon after, we realized that we had some support and we could embrace the community that so graciously opened their arms to us and face the brokenness with their support. It definitely didn't happen immediately. There were days that it would have been easier to turn around and go the other way and bury it deep inside again, and kind of do it by yourselves. But it seemed that every time we surrounded ourselves with the people at St. Luke's and the communities and the groups that we've been a part of, and been able to share our story, that we started to find a little light in our darkness.
So this summer, we were invited by Ryan and Tammy to a small group that was being held at their house called Pause. And we didn't know who was going to be there, what it was about. We didn't know anything going in, but we figured, what were we losing by trying something new? And I'm glad that we did it. For the first few weeks, Jensen and I sat in the background and just listened to everybody. And everything that Ryan and Tammy were saying completely spoke to us and fit exactly into the place that we were in our lives with losing Ellie. And it was terrifying to speak up and share our story in front of strangers, people who we didn't know how they would react to what we had to say, but we did. And it was probably the most terrifying and freeing experience all at the same time. After sharing our experience in our first group, we've had nothing but love and support from the people around us, and who make it easier each time to share just a little bit more. After Pause, we then signed up for a couples retreat in the mountains, and then a couple of other small groups through the church. And each time that we step into that unknown and involve ourselves within this community, we add a little bit more light into our darkness, a little more hope. There have been a couple of times where it would have been easy to take that step backwards and go back to that complacent, less meaningful way of life. But each time that presented itself, it would just so happen to be that we would get a grief support book from Reverend Sally in the mail, letting us know that we didn't have to face this journey alone. I think without the community at St. Luke's, I don't know what our lives would look like today. It gives us a purpose to involve ourselves in this community. We continue to find ways to surround ourselves with the support of St. Luke's. Jensen recently joined the choir. We helped with feeding of the 5K, and we continue to surround ourselves in the Communitas small groups because it gives us meaning and a purpose. In a time of darkness and heartache, this community came into our lives and helped us bring a new meaning of hope to our story, and for that we're forever grateful. Doesn't get easier the second time.
No, there's only one more time. It may get easier, it may not.
Probably not.
The good news is we get to move the last barrier to the altar to symbolically give this thing over to God. I'm grateful that y'all are here. As the band plays a song, it's called Beautiful Things. It's a song by Gungor. Many of you know it. You know what we realized as we were talking about this worship series, and as we were thinking of you all have been conquering some big barriers in your life. You've been facing fears and actually facing them and going through it. And so Reverend Sally, Reverend Jessica, and myself, we just want to offer a blessing to you all. If you're going through some stuff or you've been through some stuff and you would like a blessing to say you're doing it, I invite you to come forward. We'll just be standing up here with oil, give you a little oil blessing on the hand. There's also prayer kneelers. If you want to say a prayer, you're welcome to do that. You can come forward whenever you'd like.